Hi, I'm Dr. Greg Dorr, and we'd like to introduce you to the Bergen Chiropractic and Sports Rehabilitation podcast that we'll be doing quite regularly now. This is our first of the year, and we're lucky to have with us an expert in the topics that we'll be discussing, Joe DeFranco, as well as my partner in the practice, Dr. Megan Doyle. So our topics tonight are going to include ass to grass squatting. Is it healthy? Who should do it? Who should not? What things should we look for? As well as weightlifting over the age of 50. How do we do this and maintain our health? So initially, as I said, we'd like to start with our ass to grass squatting. It's been a hot topic for, I think, a lot of us, especially within the healthcare industry and definitely within the fitness industry. So I'd like to start by letting Joe introduce himself and his expertise and his experience. So Joe, tell us your background.
My name is Joe DeFranco. I'm the owner of DeFranco's Gym. I have been training high school, college, professional athletes and average Joes for just about 30 years now, most of pretty much my entire adult life. The first 20 years of my career was predominantly all athletes, but those high school, college, and pro athletes are now 30, 40, 50-year-old adults with your everyday back pain and lingering pain from being an athlete. So now my shift has been more longevity-based training and kind of training to feel good. Obviously, we all want to perform well and still function well, but my focus now is more based on longevity and getting people to kind of live pain-free for as long as humanly possible.
And that fits in perfectly with the topics that we're discussing today. And I know from our standpoint within our practice, we usually are not the ones that are seeing the person initially and helping them get into a training program. For the most part, we're the ones who they were in the training program and now they're seeing us because they got banged up, largely because somebody gave them a program that wasn't designed for them. It was designed for a lot of people, and it wasn't specific for them, and they end up getting hurt as a result. Our experience includes combined over 30 plus years of practice experience, lecturing all over the world, sporting events all over the world, and seeing injuries from toe to head for almost every musculoskeletal complaint as well as sport that there is. So let's get right into it. Just give initially an overall impression of, we've had these conversations in the past, but the ass to grass squat, what's actually your thought process?
So my thought process is, people ask, one of the most common questions I get is, what's the best exercise for? And the older I've gotten, my answer, and it frustrates people, but we've talked about this, my answer more and more has become, it depends. Or, I need more information. For who? For what goal? And yes, ass to grass squats can be a phenomenal tool for some athletes, some people, but for most people, it's probably not the best option. And one thing that I've been really trying to get out there, and it seems like such common sense, but there's this old school kind of meathead mentality in the athletic training world that you have to do certain exercises. I've worked with a lot of football players, so you'll hear their strength coaches tell them they have to power clean, they have to squat ass to grass. And the older I've gotten and the more injuries I've seen strength exercises kind of do more harm than good, I've come to realize that there's no mandatory exercises. If your sport isn't played with a barbell, if you're not a professional power lifter or an Olympic weightlifter, there's no mandatory exercises. Yes, I'd love to see an athlete get stronger at the squatting pattern, but the type of squat that they perform should be dictated by their specific anthropometry, their specific strength levels, their specific mobility levels, and their skill level in the weight room at doing the exercises. So that's kind of my overview of, we need more information first before we could just say, are ass to grass squats beneficial or not?
Now, let me actually expand upon that a little bit with you. What are your key things that if you see somebody right away, you're saying probably not a great ass to grass squatter? What are things that you pick up right away just looking at somebody?
Well, first, even just looking at taller, kind of thinner, taller athletes without a lot of muscle. First off, not that they can't squat ass to grass, but already I'm going to be like, they're probably not the best candidate, but let's see. And as simple as it sounds, we just have them do a basic body weight squat. And if you can't do a perfect body weight squat, I'm certainly not going to put a barbell on your back and load weight and try to get you to squat ass to grass with some arbitrary number. Strength coaches have this goal of squatting 1.5 times your body weight, two times your body weight. First, let's see, can you squat parallel with just your body weight without your knees caving in, your toes pointing out, your thoracic spine rounding? Let's do that first, then maybe we might move on. We could kind of talk about the levels of assessment. Then we'll do an overhead squat with just a PVC pipe or an empty broomstick to see what kind of mobility they have. But I want to see that they could squat unrestricted, unloaded first, and then go from there.
That's great. And I know from my standpoint, this is actually where our overlap starts really falling in to what Joe is looking at, and as well as what we're looking at is I am the same way. I want to see just a literally closed chain squat, no weight, no nothing. And we might change orientation of different body parts to see how they actually go through their squat process. But in particular, one of the first things that I actually look at is their feet. Is I want to actually see what the feet do on their squat. And that's my first go-to before anything else. If I see, as you're talking about, those toes just go way out, foot just caves in, I'm looking at it already saying this is probably not going to be the greatest person to an ass to grass squat, because they're gonna lose rotational control in their body. Mm-hmm. And as soon as you start losing rotational control in your body, you're going to see all those injuries start showing up, whether it's ITB syndromes and something basic, whether it's you'll start seeing meniscal wear, cartilage wear, medial compartment in the knee wear. And again, a little bit more common in the female than the male athlete, but also starting to see things like the labral issue. And those are areas in particular that are very seriously addressed because the surgeries aren't always the greatest options for those athletes. Is there anything in particular that you like looking at?
So I especially look at the mobility of the ankles. You have to think of the knee as the joint in between the ankle and the hip. So if you don't have that dorsiflexion in the ankle or the hip mobility to take you low, the knee is really going to take a brunt of the stress. And then the cushion in the knee, the meniscus, or the labrum in the hip is really going to be what's wearing on you.
And speaking on that, from a strength and conditioning coach's standpoint, I think it's so important. All the things you named, they're not going to show up the day they're doing the squat. It might not be painful. Like someone might have an ugly squat, but it's not painful, especially if you're dealing with high school kids or younger athletes or a younger population. And I think as strength coaches, high school, college strength coaches, they might feel like, hey, the kid doesn't complain. They didn't say their knee hurt or their hips hurt. They're fine. They keep loading the exercise and loading the exercise. But I think that's where your guys' perspective is important, because that same athlete a year after college or 2 years after, or even if it's 5 years after, when they present all these issues and they don't know, like, I never really injured myself in the weight room. I never got hurt doing the thing. It doesn't mean it's not causing more harm than good.
Yeah, I always love when patients say, yeah, but I've been doing this for 20 years. And
then that's the point.
Exactly. Right? You've been doing it for 20 years, and that's exactly why you are hurt. The body is one of the greatest adaptation mechanisms ever created. And I always say this, almost like the better the athlete is, the better their adaptation mechanisms. It's part of why they are as good as they are. But as we age in particular, our adaptation mechanisms become less and less. And now all of a sudden, when you can't compensate for the faulty mechanics, wear and tear starts developing and the injuries start becoming more prevalent. In particular, if I even have to use me as an example, Joe, I'll let you talk about it. You're not there yet. But the 40s for me were an eye-opener. Mm-hmm. That's when all of a sudden I realized you're not really an athlete anymore. You're just still playing a sport.
Yes.
It's where I started noticing I couldn't adapt to the strains. My recovery time, instead of being a day, turned into a week. So your point of it's not going to necessarily show up as injury day one, but those injuries start showing up ridiculously as the years progress. And the more, let's just say, ballistic or damaging the sport could be, the more force that has to go through that sport or activity, the more likely it'll show up sooner than later.
Yeah. The amount of times I've blown out my back tying my shoe or sneezing, it's not the sneeze, it's not the tying of the shoe, it's the 20 years of football and heavy weightlifting and all the things we talked about. And then that one thing maybe sets it off and people are shocked, but it's generally not that thing. It's the previous decades of damage that we've done. So that's why it's so important to address this stuff beforehand, before you give the bad habits, before you put all the wear and tear in your body. I'd love for this information to get to the high school strength coaches and the younger kids that are just starting to strength train, so we can maybe prevent some of these things from happening before they happen.
Joe, I'd like to throw one more thing into here before we kind of shift a little bit in our topic, but what's your feeling, because I already know your answer is going to be, on knees over toes?
Same thing. It depends. I think there's a big trend on social media now. Even knees over toes guy Ben Patrick, who I am actually personal friends with. I think he puts out great information, but so much of his stuff gets misinterpreted as well. I think people see some of these extreme ass to grass, knee over toe squats and split squats. And that is great. If you have the ability to do that and you've worked up to that level and you have the genetics to do that, that's great. But taking someone with bad knees and just shoving their knees in front of their toes and forcing them to do an ass to grass squat or a knee over toe split squat is going to do way more harm than good. I think it's great that we're aware and we maybe will focus a little bit more on dorsiflexion and ankle mobility and having the ability for our knee to go over our toe pain-free, because we all do walk up and down stairs and our knees are going to go over our toes in everyday life, and we want to prepare our body for that. But the key is always, what is your starting point right now? I've had clients that I did everything in my power when I trained them to keep their knee behind their toes for the time being until they developed the dorsiflexion and the hamstring strength and the glute strength and just the motor control. And then slowly we would progress, but just starting with extreme knee over toe stuff, I think does way more harm than good.
Yeah, and I hate to say it, but it also, again, from what we're seeing in the office is somebody comes in with knee pain, and one of the questions that I'm getting is, should I do a whole ton of knee over toe? And I'm going like,
stuff is like,
yeah, but that depends on how long you want to keep in pain. Because all it's going to do is keep activating your quadriceps a little too much,
yes,
crushing. If it's a patellar tracking disorder, you're just going to keep slamming the patella into the condyles, or at least create the faulty mechanism. And then on top of that, well, if you have a patellar tendon injury or a tear, well, that's a lot of force to put through that when it's still going through a healing phase.
Yes, yeah. It depends on the person, the time, where they're at, their starting point, their injury history. There's many, many factors. Everyone loves they want a yes or no answer, good or bad, and it's training, rehab, physical therapy. It doesn't work that way, unfortunately. We all wish it was that simple, right?
I'm going to go to you again, because I didn't get the pleasure of actually competing as a varsity athlete in college. You have. When you were in the training room, did you see that one exercise fits all for every single one of your athletes, or did you actually have your trainers, your strength and conditioning coaches actually create individual programs for you?
Yeah, unfortunately at the time, I don't think they individualized our training as much, and so I tore my ACL in college. I tore it playing, and I think I had way overdeveloped my quads from improper training and underdeveloped my hamstrings, and their muscles I overtrained and undertrained, and ultimately it ended up in an injury. So I think that if we customized more of our training, that probably wouldn't have happened.
Joe, if you're going to actually customize training, you're still looking at that simple air squat, right? That closed chain, just to get a good gauge of what that person's mobility is. Where, and again, I know it's this depends answer, but let's just say somebody has those faulty mechanics. They can't hit parallel without a butt wink. You put your arms overhead, and the first thing they have to do is trunk flexion in order to just squat down. Where do you like to start in basically getting these people, and I don't mean just from the mobility standpoint, but where do you like starting them in a strength standpoint associated with extreme bad faulty mechanics within their squat already? Where do you like to start them and then eventually help bring them into those activities that they want to do?
I always start in the pain-free range. So again, I don't like having this arbitrary, you have to squat to parallel or ass to grass. If someone could get to a quarter squat position and their spine is neutral and everything's aligned and they could do that pain-free, we start them there. And I also like speaking specifically on the squat, from the bottom up. We're just so programmed to start at the top and then lower ourselves. That's very difficult for a lot of people. So I like to have them in the bottom position. We might even have them sit on a chair or a box, physically put their body in the right position where they don't have as much stability requirements. And then from there, have them stand up. And then now let's add in the lowering, and we start that body weight. Then I might have them hold a light dumbbell, and we work from there. And then what you hear a lot about progressive overload. It doesn't only have to be adding more weight or more reps to an exercise. You could progress an exercise by increasing the range of motion, make it more difficult that way. So I like for squats that start in a pain-free range, start to load it a bit, then let's start to drop that box down or increase the range of motion, and just keep training through a pain-free range until you get to whatever their goal may be. And it doesn't necessarily have to be an ass to grass squat. It doesn't have to be parallel. If someone's goal is, as silly as it sounds, might be to just get up off the toilet without having pain, then let's try to get them to that depth of a squat, and so they could live their life pain-free. If it's an Olympic weightlifter that needs to get ass to grass, then you would work a little bit more towards that. But it's all every situation is specific to the client that you're working with in front of you.
Yeah, and as well as you're saying that, and then you could also bring in the power lifter, which is a completely different stance if they're going to do the loads that they're doing.
Yeah, you don't have to squat. You just have to get to parallel or slightly below, and that's doing it in the easiest way possible, where you have the best leverage. Bodybuilding is the opposite. You want to make the exercise the hardest. For it's where everything is situation and application specific, depending on who you're working with.
Now, since Dr. Doyle brought this up, I don't want to go too long on this, because I do think this is a topic that the three of us could literally dive into and have another large program associated with. But if you're trying to train, and again, just keeping it to the squat right now, if you're trying to train somebody specifically to prevent ACL or limit the chance of an ACL rupture, what do you want the squat to look like, and how do you want to train it?
I think, again, it depends on that person and where they're presenting, weaknesses, strengths, maybe an imbalance. We see a lot of, especially with female athletes, overdeveloped quads, underdeveloped glutes and hamstrings, adductors as well. But I think, generally speaking, what I found with knee pain and ACL tears, if the it depends answer kind of gets annoying. Generally, I think most people, athletes or just kind of general pop in general clients you're working with, most people could use more ankle mobility. A lot of people have stiff, bound up ankles, which we know if your ankles are meant to be mobile, if they're immobile, your body's going to kind of steal that mobility from the knee, which is meant to be more stable. And now we have some more knee issues and wear and tear there. So ankle mobility, lots of posterior chain strength. And also the adductors are another area I found, both strength and mobility. Most strength programs neglect the adductors, everything sagittal plane, and you don't see a lot of frontal plane stuff, side to side, rotational component. So that's another area that we've had a lot of success with addressing.
In addressing those aspects, especially adductor, do you like using, and I know your answer is going to probably be yes, but do you like using bands to assist in an adductor stimulation, foot placement, orientation, meaning like the width of the stance versus the angling of the toes in, out, straight? Is there something that you like to use in order to help engage those muscles?
All of them. Yeah. I work generally, again, speaking depends on who you're working with and how long you have them for, but 4-week blocks kind of where we have a focus on, it might be the resistance, then it might be foot positioning, and we kind of progress or vary the emphasis based on the person that we are training, their strengths and weaknesses, and the specific issue. But I think all of them have their place and should be addressed during different times. Just depends on how long you have with the client and what the specific issues they're dealing with.
I'd almost like to bring in a case study here, and I know we've talked as well as like when we do a next podcast, we're going to have a live person here so we can actually go through some of this. But as an example, in almost everything that we're talking about today, we actually had a patient come in today that's a catcher. He's a pretty high-end baseball player, not professional, but he's playing into his 40s, and he's still playing hardball baseball. It's not softball. And he's a catcher. So the first thing he's telling me is, my back hurts, I got pain in the front of my hips, I have hamstring tightness, I have Achilles and calf pain. Now, as soon as he tells me catcher and all of those things, I tend to, for the most part, break up every individual one and write my histories on every single one. And literally, as soon as he told me all those, I was like, every single one of these is linked. There's not even a question in my mind that if you're in a squat position and all these things are structurally problematic or creating discomfort, they all are linked together. Now, just to give the visualization of what his squat looked like, he literally dropped into a squat, and the first thing he did, heels off the ground, catcher mode right away, shifted his weight to one leg, you could see him dip all the way over, and immediate lean forward. So I'm looking at him and going, now do the same squat, but don't let your heels come off the ground. And he goes, I didn't even know I put him off the ground. So at that point, we actually did heels to the ground, and the first thing that happened was feet turned out, totally pronated in, and right away I'm looking at him going like, we're getting nowhere with you as a catcher until your ankles get better.
Yep.
So it's amazing, like, of course, he's on his toes all the time. That explains the whole posterior chain issue. His hips, when you look at him, are totally rolled forward. That's all of this anterior groin pain. It's the back pain he's feeling. It's now all of a sudden you're going like, this is all limited together. And if we don't start at the bottom and work our way up, none of this is going to really resolve. Not to mention his internal rotation of the hip was completely shot. So we've used the same techniques that we've used in the past.
So I ask you then, where do you even start with that?
So this was interesting, and it was because he was a new patient, and I really wanted to see how just everything would work with him. I did everything. So I did on him specifically 4 different positions actually to treat him. But I worked initially at his hips just because of simplicity. Not because that was the starting point of his injury, but simplicity. Working through his glutes, hip flexors, all of the secondary hip flexors, TFL, rectus femoris, psoas, adductors. Then because of the rotational aspect, obviously that TFL that we know we've worked with you in the past as well as that adductor hamstring hiatus, rotation came right back. Then we put him face down again, worked calf and Achilles just to loosen up that part of his posterior chain. I did not work his hamstring at all. Despite the fact that he kept talking about my hamstring's tight, we didn't work that at all. The reason was simple. When I did a straight leg raise on him, right up to 90 degrees. That's not a tight hamstring. You don't have a tight hamstring if you can get your leg up to 90 degrees. Interestingly enough, when he did it actively, never got to 90 degrees. He's not using his hip flexors well.
Yeah.
They're tight. They're definitely not functioning well. They're not firing well, and his pelvis is rolling over as soon as you engage them. Even basic little things like hip supine flexion tests, he didn't even get to 120 degrees on one of his hips. And that's a catcher.
Yeah.
So that's guaranteed to create a whole lot of problems. And even worse is, like I said, he put his arms overhead, and the first thing he did is he's dropping forward. So we treated, again, those glutes, the hip flexors, all those things, prone and supine. We did the calves and the Achilles initially. I told him we're probably going to be doing these weight bearing as you get a little bit more advanced. Then we put him standing over a physio ball and literally just had him start back and forth, working lat all the way down into that low back QL region. And then oddly enough, I said, you know what, based on what you're doing here, And the way I'm seeing that over accentuation, it's like, I think we should probably hit your abdominals and your diaphragm. And all of a sudden he goes, I struggle with breathing when I'm playing. And I was like, not even something he complained about, but right away. He was one of the greatest examples of what we call kinetic chain dysfunction that I've seen. And it, no question in my mind, started at his ankles. But when he was younger, you can always compensate for your ankle stuff. But as that wear and tear develops over decades, now all of a sudden the knee, now all of a sudden the hip, now all of a sudden the back, and all these other things start showing up.
Yeah, and you run out of compensations. You worked his way right up the chain.
Now, my biggest challenge, which, I mean, I always love this. Every single time I think I come up with something really cool in exercise, I look at Dr. Doyle and she's already advanced it to like 3 levels above what I was doing before. But I'm looking at him going like, I'm going to have 50 exercises to give you. No, because he'll never do them. I have to come up with full chain exercises for him that's going to stimulate all the right strengthening and help neurally balance all of those tight. And I got to be honest, I told him, I was like, I'm not doing any rehab with you today. I have too much stuff that I want to think about as to what to bring into your program to make sure I've got 3 to 5 exercises to get you better, not 50 that you're going to be like, I don't have an hour and a half to sit here and do rehab.
Yep.
What is your experience with the athletic population, especially when it starts becoming kinetic chain? You know, it's not just that; it's the chain is dysfunctional.
That I was just gonna, before you even asked that, say that's so interesting to me, because that's where like that fine line between, you could come up with 100 different exercises for him to do, and they might all be beneficial, but in the real world, he's got a job, he's got a life, you have other patients, like you need to, there's perfect kind of world, and then there's real world. And that's where my brain was thinking of just some clients I've had where there's 1,000,001 different things I want to do, but that's where you have to kind of take a step back, kind of exactly like you said, give me a day or two, let me think about all this, and let me come up with 3 to 5 exercises that are, what's one exercise that is going to help maybe improve 2 or 3 of the issues that you're having. And a lot of times that might be an ankle cleans up some things up the chain or whatever it may be. It depends on the case, but it's taking a step back and figuring out where can I get the best bang for my buck, and let's do 3 to 4, 5 tops of those. So realistically, he could kind of work on those things and actually see some improvement rather than overwhelm them. They do it for a day or 2, you can't stick with it. It's like a diet. People try to give you the perfect, chicken breast and rice. Nobody's gonna eat that 6 times a day, and then they just go off the rails and end up going to McDonald's. Let's make one change, and then we could sprinkle in something else. That's how you get long-term results.
So I want to go to Dr. Doyle one more time, and I kind of alluded to it before. Like every single time, I think I came up with something cool, or maybe I expanded on something that I saw somebody else do. The next thing you know, I see Dr. Doyle doing, and she's already expanded on it like within a week. Like it's taken me years to figure out how to expand upon things. It's like a day later, she's already doing it herself. From your standpoint of your creativity and progression, regression, where is your thought process? And when you're seeing somebody and you say, it's time to move you into something, because one of the other things we don't want is our patients getting bored. We don't want our people who are working out with us going like, this one again. Mm-hmm. Like, where is your brain when it's like, how do I actually advance this? How do I make this more creative? How do I make this better for this patient based on where they are at this time?
So I always want to advance when someone is saying this exercise is easy, one. Another, I want to always make it sport specific. So if someone, used to play baseball, you make it more into a baseball type exercise where they might be throwing a weighted ball or something along those lines. But I also want to make sure at the same time that the exercise I'm trying to accomplish is using the muscle that I want them to use, because you can work out someone's, let's say you want to do a glute exercise with someone, they're like, oh, I only feel this in the front of my hips. So that means, either you have to modify the exercise or you have to switch the exercise, because you're not trying to work out the hip flexors, you're trying to work out the glutes. So in that aspect, I'll always customize per patient.
Well, I hope you guys have actually found this exciting. Honestly, I hate to say this, but I think we probably could have gone for another hour and a half on this topic. But we also want to make sure that you have time in your own life to do things as well. So from us to you, I hope you enjoyed the topics and look forward to our next one.